Another term that we throw out a lot with cases, and you'll see used a lot as you research case projects, are so-called ATA cases. This is a tremendously confusing term. ATA originated with efforts of the airlines to come up with packaging that was adequate to handle some of the delicate repair parts. Airlines need to handle these within their own system, but early on, a lot of the most of the major airlines, in fact, all of the major airlines, may compete on the surface, but they cooperate at night behind the curtain by exchanging essential spare parts. So if your favorite airline has a hub here in Atlanta, and an airline that only flies in here a relatively small amount of time has a need for a replacement part, they would work out an exchange or a financial arrangement to be able to draw from your favorite large airline that's based here. However, both of those parties would want to make sure that those parts were adequately protected. So in the early days of this evolution, the organization that was formed by the airlines was called the Air Transport Association, ATA. And in those early days, most of the cases were the older so-called music roadie cases, the fabricated cases, where we have fabricated panels trapped by extrusions. And of course, you could build those out of a variety of materials. But in those early days, we also had something called fiberboard cases. These were the cases a lot of salespeople used, and just like they imply, it was a relatively thin fiberboard that was adequate to carry things, dress samples from the trunk of your car into a department store buyer's office, but certainly not adequate to protect the gyroscope that plane needs to depend on. That's an extremely delicate item. So there was a temptation to try to go for the cheap and use that older style of fiberboard, or to build so-called fabricated cases from very inexpensive materials that very often caused catastrophe. So again, this predated some of the packaging analytic techniques we have now to be able to actually use instrumentation to determine the fragility of an item, what kind of protection it needs, and to analyze the environment it's going into and make sure that the two mesh. So in those early days, it was trial and error. They literally would package up a replica of the device, very often just a broken unit, and ship it 50 times, 100 round trips. And if it made it through that test, it was considered a pass. And that would be a so-called ATA Class 1 container. Now, there were situations where things that were less delicate didn't necessarily need that stringent packaging, so they have other classes that might relate to, say, just a corrugated box and foam set, might be adequate for that, and they might, specify that be good for 5 or 10 trips, etc. So but for purposes of cases, the standard was set for the idea that it would stand up to 100 round trips to be an ATA Category 1 case. But here's the other great big kicker. Many of these fabricated cases had protruding locks, latches, and handles. So when they went into the cargo hold of the aircraft, these protrusions would do a lot of damage to other cargo or to customer luggage, or even do damage to the people that were handling these devices. So part of that standard was to have the hardware recessed. So you look now at that style of case, and you see a dish where the latch is. You see that the handles are spring loaded, so they snap down and don't extrude or don't extend beyond the profile of the case, so that it's you're not. And very often these things would literally damage each other. because of that. So the AT standard didn't tell you much, except they had to be rugged enough to stand up to those round trips, and that it had to be a smooth case. And by and large, the implication was that it was at least a half-inch, if not a three-quarter-inch plywood base, and ideally a fairly decent quality of plywood. And in turn, although it wasn't called out in the standard, the understanding was that it would have a textured finish so that you could replace labels and not build up a god-awful amount of residue. The textured surface would let you adhere them fairly well, but still be able to scrape them off effectively. And in turn, the other standard was that everybody else made their cases black, gray, and olive drab. In airline world, they were white. So those were the more or less the three criteria. So in turn, other folks realized, hey, this is a good idea. So I'm going to say that I want an ATA case for my requirements. So over time, that word ATA, or case, simply spread as an acronym for a reasonably sturdy case, usually the fabricated style of case, and that the hardware is recessed. So most of the time, the term is thrown around without any quantification of what it really means. Then we complicated the issue when we came out with a plethora of large molded cases that has the superior qualities in terms of water resistance and the efficiency of molding, and these began to be used in the airline industry and similar applications. So in turn, those were tested to the same standard. And by now, as the years passed, rather than physically ship the item 100 round trips, we can get a lot better feedback by putting it through a series of laboratory tests that involve dropping from given heights. And those drop heights are determined by the size and weight of the case, and that indirectly infers how it's handled. That is, if you have a small item that's under 10 pounds, people are going to pick that up and carry it waist high. Something bad happens, that can easily be a 24 or 36 inch drop height. If conversely now, if you have a 100-pound device and people are doing something with it by hand, they're not going to be lifting it very high, or they're going to have it on a forklift. So your normal drop would be somewhere around 12 to 18 inches. If it's on a pallet, you might even be satisfied with a test that says, okay, this slipped off the tip of the pallet jack just as I was unloading it. One end dropped 6 inches. So that's called a rotational drop test, and you may do that a given number of inches, etc. So by utilizing this combination of drop tests and by running the package through a series of different frequencies and magnitudes of vibration, we can simulate the shipping requirement. We can subject it to the same stress that it would probably see in that 100 round trips. That's a lot faster, it's a lot less expensive, and it's more highly quantified. Because again, when we sent it out to that 100 round trip, was there one situation where it was going up the ramp into the airplane, someone made a miscue, and it fell from the tailgate of the airplane to the tarmac? There are circumstances where in military spec world where we do design cases that will withstand that 18 to 21 foot drop. But even the Airline Transport Association didn't try to design to that standard with their own gear because it's relatively rare. And my guess is that they really emphasize their people, when you see that white box, be darn careful. So in short, the word ATA can convey a very strict standard that both the molded cases and fabricated cases may have been tested to and may apply. But more than likely, it just refers, going back to those early days, a wood-based fabricated case that doesn't have a lot of protruding hardware. And so that the correct way to describe that would be to say this is an ATA style case, not an ATA compliant case. So the reason there's so much confusion about the ATA case is that so many folks who make a mediocre quality of wood case will hang that tag on it in an attempt to enhance the image of the product. So unfortunately, it is very often degraded in that sense to something that's almost meaningless, that where just about any rough configuration of wood stuck in an extrusion that, if you're lucky, we'll get it through one shipment, will get you there. So unless you actually called out the terminology that this is ATA Category 1 compliant and validated. So in turn, when our molded case folks come to us, for example, and say, "Yeah, I got a new case shell here," they need to be able to hand us test data that says that this style of case has gone out to an independent testing lab, and here's the data that we can share with you if you're interested.